Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of our colleagues across the time zones. On behalf of APT Associates, I'd like to thank you for joining us this morning for what we think is a very timely discussion about resilience. Thank you, and good morning. My name is Lorine Giangola. I am part of APT's Division of Health and Environment and also leading APT's company-wide resilience initiative. And so I'll be your moderator and host for today's event. Next slide, please, Jean. Here are a few basic tips to manage the webinar. To minimize all background noise, all attendees have been muted for the duration of the webinar. Please use the chat feature to let us know if you're having any technical problems, and also use the chat feature to submit your questions at any time during the presentation. We will record this webinar and post it at a later date, and we'll share that location with everyone who's attending today. So we'll begin with a brief introduction to the concept of resilience, and then we'll discuss a couple of app projects that are aiming to build resilience across sectors and disciplines. And we have a very impressive panel of speakers today. Ambassador John Lange from the United Nations Foundation, Sherry Stout from the National Renewable Energy Lab, and Raymond Martinez from the Pueblo de San Ildefonso. And we have a panel discussion and a participant Q&A session lined up for this morning's event. And then finally, we'll close with a brief wrap up. Next slide, Jean. So we'd like to start with clarifying what we're talking about when we talk about the concept of resilience. Resilience is the capacity to recover from an event. And resilience is not a new concept. For decades, it has been a fundamental principle in some disciplines, particularly in the natural sciences and engineering fields. And next slide, Jean. But it also has relevance to and is emerging as an important concept in many other disciplines and across sectors and scales. Resilience has important applications to physical and mental health, to disaster risk management, to ecological restoration and conservation, to economics and financing, to agriculture and food security, and to energy and infrastructure. And resilience is becoming more common, and it's often confused with and used interchangeably with related but distinct concepts such as risk mitigation, risk reduction, and adaptation. And one of the goals of APT's Resilience Initiative is to ensure that we distinguish among these terms when we talk about work to build resilience. So we like to briefly review the relationships among these terms. For example, before a hurricane, people take measures to reduce the risk of storm impact. And coastal communities have adapted to flooding, storm surge, and sea level rise by elevating homes. Next slide. And these risk reduction and adaptation measures reduce vulnerability to impact. Reducing vulnerability often involves reducing exposure to and sensitivity to impact and building adaptive capacity to manage impact. So to use a current example, public and private sector and civil society efforts to encourage social distancing reduce exposure to infection to COVID-19. Access to preventative and continuous health care reduces individuals' sensitivity to infection. And technology solutions can help strengthen adaptive capacity to manage outbreaks or pandemics. And sadly, at tremendous social and economic costs, some industries and workers are not able to work remotely, but one bright spot today is that many private and public sector groups have swiftly adopted new technologies and policies to allow workers to continue many daily activities while working remotely. So many of us here on this webinar today are fortunate that we can work from home, probably in our sweatpants. It's okay to admit that today, I think. And so that is an example of tremendous adaptive capacity to very adverse circumstances and tremendous impact. The next slide, please. We'd like to briefly highlight a couple of APT's many projects that are working to build resilience across sectors and scales. APT works to build resilience of individuals, communities, institutions, and governments to diverse impacts across the sector. So we work to build resilience to natural and human-caused disasters and their impacts on ecosystems, public health, and livelihoods. We work to build resilience to epidemics and pandemics and their impacts on individual health, health systems, communities, and economies. We are working with governments to increase climate variability and climate change impacts on natural resources, agriculture and food security, economic development, and human health. And we also work to build resilience to economic and financial shocks and their impacts on housing and homelessness, public health, and sustainable economic development. One project we'd like to highlight is APT's work on the Deepwater Horizon oil spill restoration and recovery. So since 2010, and since the oil spill occurred in the Gulf of Mexico, APT scientists have worked to assess and quantify natural resource damages. And we are currently continuing to work with local governments and with stakeholders in the region to plan restoration measures across different habitat types and for different species. And APT's health system resilience work is diverse and extensive. APT is working with governments to develop national influenza preparedness plans, to help governments advance vector control, to utilize data science and technology to advance detection and surveillance, and to engage public and private sectors to advance multi-sectoral responses. And now that we've talked about the concept of resilience and clarified resilience and this difference from actions to reduce vulnerability, we'd like to turn to our panel discussion with our speakers. And I'd like to give a brief introduction to each of our speakers, and then we will turn to a question and answer format for the rest of the webinar. Ambassador John Lange is a senior fellow for global health diplomacy at the United Nations Foundation. He has held leadership positions in the Global Polio Eradication Initiative and the Measles and Rubella Initiative. Earlier, he spent 4 years at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, engaging in high-level global health diplomacy with African governments. Ambassador Lange had a distinguished 28-year career in the Foreign Service at the U.S. Department of State, where he was a pioneer in the field of global health diplomacy. He served as Special Representative on Avian and Pandemic Influenza, Deputy Inspector General, Deputy U.S. Global AIDS Coordinator at the inception of the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, and U.S. Ambassador to Botswana, where HIV/AIDS was a signatory. He led the U.S. Embassy in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania at the time of the August 1998 terrorist bombing, for which he received the State Department's Distinguished Honor Award. And the United Nations and its agencies have been clients and collaborators of APT in countries around the world. So we're very happy to collaborate with the UN Foundation on today's event. And Ambassador Lange, we should point out for our audience here that when we began planning this webinar a few months ago, a few cases of a new coronavirus had emerged in China, and we didn't know a lot about it, and it wasn't a very common point of discussion. And here we are today in the midst of a pandemic. So, it's an especially busy time for you and your colleagues, and we thank you for your time this morning. And we look forward to hearing your perspectives during this once-in-a-lifetime moment for many of us. Our next panelist is Sherry Stout. Sherry is an engineer with the U.S. Department of Energy's National Renewable Energy Lab, or NREL. And Sherry works in the Integrated Application Center at NREL. Much of Sherry's work at NREL focuses on energy development with American Indian tribes and Alaska Native villages, including energy and resilience planning, resource assessment, microgrid assessment, and energy development for economic development. Sherry also works on international programs where she focuses on grid integration of distributed renewable generation, energy water nexus issues, energy system resilience, and interconnection processes. Sherry also works on resilience issues, including distributed generation and microgrids for energy system resilience and development of resilience frameworks and best practices. And NREL has been both a client and a partner to APT in work to strengthen energy system resilience to climate and non-climate impacts. So thanks, Sherry, for joining us this morning. And finally, our last panelist is Raymond Martinez, who is the director of the Pueblo de San Ildefonso's Department of Environmental and Cultural Preservation, or DSEP, and also the Tribal Risk Assessment Program Manager. Raymond is leading a climate resilience planning process for the San I Pueblo. We often say San I for short instead of San Ildefonso. DSEP has been an APT client for several years, and APT has worked with DSEP to assess damages to San I natural resources from historical contamination from the Los Alamos laboratory. And currently, APT is working with DSEP to lead a climate resilience planning process and to engage the San I community in assessing climate vulnerabilities and developing strategies to strengthen resilience to climate impacts. And so I'd like to ask each speaker to begin by just sharing an overview of your institution's work to build resilience in the sector and communities that you focus on, and to explain why building resilience has become an explicit goal of your institution. And Ambassador Lange, I'd like to start with you. If you could give us a brief introduction to the UN Foundation's resilience work.
Thanks very much, Lorine, and thanks for the invitation today from APT Associates. I've been impressed by your work to increase performance of health systems in many countries. I'm very pleased to be here. At the UN Foundation, we connect people, ideas, and resources to the UN to deliver a better world for all. One of the main goals, of course, being to achieve the promise of the Sustainable Development Goals. And that can only be accomplished if the solutions are durable and resilient in the long term. We work with the World Health Organization and other multilateral organizations engaged in strengthening health systems, which is the area that I focus on at the UN Foundation. And one of the fundamental building blocks to develop resilient capacity to prevent, detect, and respond to infectious disease outbreaks is WHO's international health regulations, which I'll talk more about a bit later. On an area that's not related to my focus of health, but to the broader discussion of resiliency today, we also focus on helping communities build resilience to climate change, particularly among smallholder farmers in the developing world who are increasingly vulnerable to a changing climate. We're working to elevate issues of climate change, resilient agriculture, nutrition, and food systems among key decision makers, so as to help prepare communities for the changes that are already destabilizing the lives of the forest, and will do so at a growing rate, I'm sad to say, in the coming years. And from our perspective, we see the UN Secretary General's announcement that he will convene a Food Systems Summit next year as a critical opportunity to advocate for more resilient agriculture and food systems, both to counter the effects of climate change and to realize the promise of the Sustainable Development Goals.
Thank you, Ambassador Lange, for that overview. And I'd like to turn to Sherry next. Sherry, if you could give us a brief overview of NREL's work to build resilience and why resilience has become an explicit goal of NREL's work.
Yeah, thank you, Lorine, and thank you for the opportunity to present on this webinar today. So NREL, like you said, is one of the U.S. Department of Energy's national laboratories. We're located in Golden, Colorado, so just outside of Denver. NREL's mission is to transform energy, and we do that by advancing the science and engineering of energy efficiency, sustainable transportation, and renewable power technologies, and by providing the knowledge to integrate and optimize energy and energy-dependent systems. So as such, our work really spans science and engineering, but also policy, urban and regional planning, economics, finance, data analytics, visualization, high-performance computing. And we work with about 900 partners across different jurisdictional scales of the government, as well as industry foundations and academic institutions. So resilience really falls under our mission as we work to enhance energy and cybersecurity. We also work to ensure and modernize energy systems, create economic opportunity through clean energy development, and work with jurisdictions really at all levels to ensure that infrastructure is capable of meeting existing and emerging human needs. So as we move toward our mission of transforming the energy landscape, really more than anything, we're working to make sure that systems, and that's infrastructure, regulatory systems, economic systems, are really ready for those changes. And so from that perspective, we work on resilience and resilience planning and development with everything from the Department of Defense, state, local, tribal communities within the United States, and also with international partners.
Okay, thanks, Sherry. Thanks for that overview. And I'm afraid Raymond Martinez may not be able to join. He just got word that there was an urgent meeting to discuss preparedness and responses to COVID-19, as all of us have experienced lately. So I am not sure if he's going to be able to join on the line, but I can fill in the meantime. I think all of us here in the last couple of weeks are getting used to working on plans B and C and D and G. So we will improvise, and hopefully Raymond can join us. As I mentioned in the introduction to Raymond and his work at the Department of Environmental and Cultural Preservation, DSEP is currently working to develop a climate resilience plan, and we've been very privileged and very happy to help DSEP in that process. So we have been working with the community there to engage stakeholders in assessing climate vulnerabilities of the Pueblo and its natural resources, and to develop strategies to strengthen resilience to the climate impacts that the Pueblo has experienced. And I can talk about some more details of our work to develop a climate resilience plan as we get into the Q&A, just in case Raymond isn't able to join us. So next, I'd like to move into this question and answer phase of the webinar. And I have a few questions that I'd like to direct to each panelist. And then after that, we will open it up to the audience for questions. So again, if you think of questions during this panel discussion, please enter them into your chat box, and our colleagues here at APT will be monitoring that, and we will field those questions to the panelists. So to begin, I have a question for Ambassador Lange. The extent of the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic is immense and ranges across sectors and scales. Individuals are experiencing impacts on their physical and mental health. Households are experiencing financial stress of illness and job losses. Local communities and economies experience hardship as workers become ill and businesses shut down, and as tourism and commerce have come to a halt. And the global economy is suffering as international travel and commerce decline, and as global markets respond to uncertainty. Recovering from these impacts will require efforts of individuals, communities, the private sector, and subnational and national governments around the world. So there are many questions about how this recovery will occur. So Ambassador Lange, what are the characteristics of a global community that is resilient to a pandemic like COVID-19?
Thank you. It's something that is in some respects obvious, and in other respects very difficult to achieve when you talk about characteristics of resilience. When you define resilience as the capacity to recover from an impact, we're dealing now with, in many respects, the most severe impact of our lifetimes, and at least since World War II. And we have to recognize that any pandemic, from a new infectious disease for which we do not have vaccines or therapeutics already on hand, has the potential to cause great suffering and death. Historically, there have been about 3 pandemic influenzas per century. So far in this century, we've had one, H1N1 swine flu pandemic of 2009, 2010. So we have pandemic influenza ahead of us at some point, as well as the current pandemic, which is not influenza, of course, it's a coronavirus. To me, one of probably the most fundamental characteristic of global community resiliency is preparation. And there have been efforts that I can talk about more later about in the past to try to prepare for pandemics, and we're better prepared now than we were 20 and 30 years ago. But it's pretty clear that the world is grossly underprepared for this pandemic. But in addition to preparation and building up that capability to respond if and when a pandemic occurs, there are other characteristics that I think are really important. One is leadership at all levels, from the international level, the Secretary General of the United Nations and the Director General of the World Health Organization, to national governments, presidents and prime ministers, to states and provinces, to local communities. And that leadership, not just for the time of crisis, but leadership to stress the importance of resilience when it's not the time of crisis, so that they don't forget the importance of being prepared. There's also another characteristic I would say is transparency in communicating to a nation's citizens and to the international community the nature of threats, the need for preparedness, and measures that will be taken in the event of an emergency. There's also a need, and I think we're seeing this in varying levels of effort right now, of solidarity to maintain lifelines and safety nets for vulnerable communities and populations, including in those in countries with the weakest health systems. And that's been a particular emphasis of Dr. Tedros, the Director General of the World Health Organization, when he first declared the novel coronavirus to be a public health emergency of international concern, international health regulations, on January 30th. He actually said the main reason for this declaration is not because of what is happening in China, but because of what is happening in other countries. Our greatest concern is the potential for the virus to spread to countries with weaker health systems and which are ill-prepared to deal with it. There's great concern in the international community about the impact this novel coronavirus pandemic will have on low-income countries. And actually, in that regard, you had asked me earlier about the work of the UN Foundation. We are hosting, on behalf of the World Health Organization, a Solidarity Response Fund to raise money from a wide range of donors to support the work of WHO during this pandemic. And that's so far been quite successful. As of today, it's raised $74 million from corporations and individuals. When I talk about the characteristics that are part of this, I have to say one of the most important ones, and I don't see this really taking place today in the 24/7 news coverage of this pandemic that you can find on cable news or in the reactions of the U.S. Congress, is a long-term perspective. I think one of the most important characteristics for a global community is to have a long-term perspective so that they build into efforts today the potentiality of using things in the long term that may not be the immediate concern today. If you look at the piece of legislation that the U.S. Congress passed earlier, which was very good. It was $8.5 billion, and it was very important that they did this. But they limited in sections of it. It's called the Coronavirus Preparedness and Response Supplemental Appropriation 2020. They limited it in sections to coronavirus, so that if you had a pandemic influenza, the money wouldn't be able to be used for that. I thought that was very short-sighted. Even though the goal is good, but the problem is we need to think in the long term what other events can come up so that we can build capacity and then have the better capability to respond and to be resilient from a severe impact. And part of that long-term capacity building, from my perspective, includes sustainable long-term financing. There has been a consensus in the community of global health security experts that I work with frequently that when the preparations were made for the H5N1 bird flu potential pandemic, and that's where I served as you heard, as the special representative on avian and pandemic influenza at the State Department from 2006 to 2009, when instead we had the H1N1 swine flu pandemic, and it turned out to be a moderate, that the consensus is that it did more harm than, because what it did was it made people think, many people who don't follow this closely enough, think, oh, we can survive a pandemic influenza. And it did more harm than good in terms of long-term funding. It wasn't until the Global Health Security Agenda was developed in 2014 and the Ebola crisis occurred that there was a much greater awareness globally, and including in the United States, of the need for strong support for strengthening health systems. But even then, the appropriations from the U.S. Congress, as an example, were limited in time to 5 years, not built into the budgets in terms of the regular budget cycle. And if we, in the United States and in other countries, continue to just deal with a current issue and then let the money go away, rather than build it into long-term capacity building, we will not be sufficiently resilient to future pandemics.
Thank you, Ambassador Lange, and it's just very valuable to be able to hear your reactions in real time to a situation that is evolving very rapidly. So thank you for that insight. And just as a follow-up, certainly this pandemic is something that none of us has experienced in our lifetimes, but certainly you've experienced other impacts on global health and serious public health impacts. What is one success story from your career that illustrates an effective approach to building resilience to outbreaks or pandemics?
Yeah, I think the most significant success story is the international health regulations that I mentioned earlier. And it really came out of the SARS epidemic in 2003, which was very scary but was able to be controlled. And that spurred the World Health Assembly, which is all the member states of WHO, to get together and to urge that the international health regulations be changed because they were very, very limited in scope until then. And finally, they were approved by the World Health Assembly in the year 2005. They came into force in the year 2007. This is international law. It's the idea that 196 states parties, as they say, 196 governments signed up to these, including the U.S. government, signed up to implement these regulations, was really a huge success because the purpose of the regulations is to build capacities for surveillance and response to be able to detect, assess, and report public health events. And it has some specific measures at ports and airports and ground crossings to limit the spread of health risks. It has a reporting requirement so that countries cannot be quiet and cover up what they are doing if it could be a public health emergency of international concern. They cannot do that without violating the regulations. There is all hazard risk assessment. It's really a fundamental building block to global health security. And I think that the international community can be proud that it created these in the year 2005. The problem is, and this gets back to my earlier point about the lack of long-term sustained funding, there is not enough money to implement these regulations. There's a mechanism that's called the Joint External Evaluation, where countries are very open about having independent assessment teams come into the country, determine where they need to improve in their capabilities, published on the WHO website, and then in the poorest countries that can't afford to do this themselves, they don't have enough assistance from development partners to implement the action plans that will improve their capabilities. And so I look on the IHR, the International Health Regulations, as a major success to build resilience, but it's still far from its promise because the funding has not been there to implement those action plans.
Thank you, Ambassador Lange, for those thoughts. I'd like to shift gears a bit from talking about global health diplomacy and public health responses to talking about resilient energy systems. And my next question is for Sherry Stout of NREL. Resilient energy systems play a critical role in reducing vulnerabilities to and supporting recovery from natural or human-caused disasters, public health crises, economic and financial shocks, and other types of impacts. These systems provide the power that individuals and public and private sector users need to implement recovery actions. Rural areas, both in the U.S. and internationally, can face additional challenges during periods of recovery because of geographic isolation and, in some cases, more limited access to resources. Sherry, when NREL designs resilient energy systems for rural areas, what are the most important potential impacts to consider?
Yeah, great question. So energy is one of those things that people really don't think about until it's no longer there, and everybody really thinks about it. So when we talk about energy systems, most people almost immediately think of electricity and electrical systems, but that is really only one part of the equation. We also need to look at things like heat, particularly for northern or cold climates, transportation, fuels, and even internet connectivity. So within that framework, you're right, rural areas often have unique challenges, but also opportunities. So I think it's important to remember that rural communities are not necessarily monolithic. They're diverse in culture, in economy, in social structures, geography. But with that said, there are some general distinctions between rural and urban areas. So rural areas tend to revolve more around one or two economic drivers. Agriculture or mining would be examples, than do their urban counterparts. They also, by definition, are really characterized by a lower population density, and that makes things like the delivery of water, power, fuel, goods, or even the movement of people more challenging and thus often more costly. And then the rapid movement of people from rural areas to urban centers has led some of the rural communities, both the United States and abroad, to experience population decline. And that further exacerbates that issue of cost of delivering services and goods to people. Those costs, along with their dependence on energy resources imported over distance. So, for example, propane here in the state of Colorado is delivered over distance to our rural communities. That can increase the vulnerability of rural communities to things like energy price shocks. And so with the challenges of delivery of fuel and goods and services, delivery of power is often also more challenging. So many rural utilities, for example, a lot of rural cooperatives don't own their own generation. They're served by limited transmission lines that are coming in from outside of their service territories. And so these utilities may have higher cost per customer to deliver power as they're sending power over longer distances to fewer people. It can also make delivery of power to rural customers more challenging, and that adds some vulnerabilities you don't necessarily see in urban zones. So another thing we really look at, again, with sort of these energy challenges is what's the impact of the changing supply chains in delivering energy. For example, if a hurricane hits in the southeast, that can impact building material supplies in rural Alaska. And so when these supply chain issues, even though they're not unique to rural areas, the challenges that exist already in these communities really exacerbate those challenges. And even in non-disaster scenarios, supply chain challenges can limit options for communities that are trying to just boost local resilience and prepare ahead of time. Another issue that we see a lot in rural areas is many lack workforces that are that are really trained in emerging technologies, solar or wind technologies, for example. And this makes it a little more difficult for rural workers to pivot into changing and emerging conditions. It can also make communities more economically vulnerable when major economic drivers experience changes. We've seen that in parts of the American Southwest with changes in what power generation looks like, and now we have underemployed communities. So another thing that we see in rural jurisdictions and some urban jurisdictions is that rural jurisdictions tend to have staff that are more generalized than their urban counterparts. So in other words, they're wearing a lot of different hats. One example, a mayor of a community might also work for the utility and run the local store. And so when these rural staff have to make decisions to respond rapidly to changing conditions, they have to figure out, which hat is the most important right now, and how do they prioritize all of their different roles. With all of that said, I do want to note, rural communities have significant opportunities for resilience as well. Rural communities also tend to have really strong social ties and have a self-reliance mindset that can be a benefit to resilience. Many of these communities have more distributed systems, for example, using septic systems, using distributed wells, that makes their overall community less vulnerable to a single point of failure, which is an advantage. And they're net exporters of food and energy. So rural areas in the United States really are the heart of a complex system of interactions, both internal and external to their communities. So they present this really critical need for increased resilience, not just within their communities, but also within their regions. So urban areas are really dependent on their rural neighbors for most of their goods. And this creates an opportunity to foster regional resilience through cooperation between rural and urban communities. And one thing that Ambassador Lange noted that I think is also important to think about is there is this need for long-term funding solutions to build resilience within energy systems as well. So, one of the big global challenges is how do you put a dollar value to resilience? And that's true both in urban areas and in rural, although rural areas tend to have a harder time accessing capital. But when you start looking at how do you fund resilience, it's figuring out how do you put a dollar on that, and then how do you take that dollar value and actually find long-term sustainable funding options to boost resilience prior to some major event happening.
Great, thank you, Sherry. And you've described some just very, very complex dynamics that occur at large scales and have tremendous impacts at the local level when you're trying to develop this system. So to follow up on that, given all of these challenges that you're dealing with when you're working in rural areas, which specific design features or characteristics increase an energy system's resilience to the impacts and the challenges that you've described?
Yeah, so first I really want to point out that design solutions need to meet the broader community goals. Just having a super robust or super resilient energy system is, in and of itself is interesting, but maybe not actually meeting community goals. So usually communities, when they come to us saying we want, to plan for resilience, they have some sort of a specific goal in mind. So that's often things like reducing the cost of energy for residents, bolstering economic resilience in the community, withstanding certain natural hazards, those kind of things. So when we do resilience assessment and planning, what we're really doing is developing a roadmap to achieve the goals the community already has. And so it's also, there's rarely a one-size-fits-all solution to community resilience. Communities are diverse, and thus their resilient solutions are equally diverse. So some of the characteristics we look for, I think in the time constraint that we have here, probably not going to hit all of them, but a few, one of the things we look for is how connected is the system? And by that, we mean a couple of things. One, internet connectivity is really important here, particularly with more distributed systems, the growth of variable renewable technologies, so things like solar or wind that are dependent on the weather. So how are those interconnected? How are those controlled? That's something we just sort of look for in general at the system, but also on connectivity. Is the system redundant? Is it fed from more than one direction? Is it only getting power from one place? If one part of the system fails, does the whole system fail? Or can there be options for changing how the system operates? We also look at what we call robustness, and there's different ways to define all of these terms, but really what we're looking at is, was the infrastructure designed to withstand the expected conditions? For example, in terms of changing climate conditions, local infrastructure might have been built to withstand a Category 3 hurricane, but now we're actually seeing Category 5 hurricanes in the same area. What changes need to be made? Is the system able to withstand, for example, that level of wind? And so that's what we look at. We look at robustness. We also look at flexibility. Can the system be flexible to changing conditions, either in how it operates or in how it actually responds to impacts or responds to those hazards when they encounter the system. We also look at how long it takes to recover the system. And so some of this goes back to that connectivity place of, can we even figure out where on the system, for example, after a hurricane, can we figure out which houses lack electricity? If the system is well connected through internet connectivity, that's actually easier to locate than driving around and looking at every home. But what are the outside inputs needed to recover the system? And this is where rural areas often have unique challenges, in that if you need a lot of outside input and you have limited supply chain and transportation issues, it takes a lot longer to recover those systems. One of the things that we look at a lot is, what's the human system that's involved? For example, how coordinated is the system in the community? So the greater coordination we see among communities, the generally better the resilience planning. Generally greater resilience, I guess is the way to say it, that the communities have or show, rather than siloed systems. So siloed systems, if you only, you're not talking to your outside neighbors, you don't have, for example, mutual aid agreements in place, those can make it harder to recover at the community level, whereas those connected communities that are connected to other systems that may not be equally impacted tend to recover quite quickly, or at least more quickly than siloed systems.
Thanks, Sherry, and it's very interesting. I think a lot of the terms and the concepts that you've described, I think, are very easy for all of us to understand, even those of us who aren't engineers, and they seem quite transferable to other disciplines and considering resilience in other sectors and other scales. And I'd just like to point out, I'd love to thank Sherry for sharing this photo that we're seeing on the screen. APT and NREL were working together over the last couple of years on developing a resilience action plan for the Lao People Democratic Republic power sector. And when we were there, the Mekong was at very high levels, and we were looking at transmission lines practically in the water of the Mekong. So the impacts are very concrete many times. So thanks, Sherry. And I'm afraid Raymond Martinez was not available to join us, and our next question is for him. But I'm going to channel Raymond so that I can provide a little bit of a background on the climate resilience planning process in the San Ildefonso Pueblo and APT's work to support the Department of Environmental and Cultural Preservation in developing this resilience action plan. So we are currently working with DCEP and other Sanai community members to identify strategies that build resilience to climate variability and climate change impacts. And through our conversations with tribal elders, tribal youth, the tribal council, and other members of the Pueblo, we have learned about some climate impacts and vulnerabilities that have not emerged in climate resilience planning processes in other communities or countries where we work. Specifically, we learned how climate change impacts, such as shifts in the habitat ranges of culturally significant plants and animals, are affecting the Pueblo's ability to carry out its traditional activities and to transfer traditional knowledge and language to younger generations. And so one of the questions that we have for Raymond is, how do these climate impacts affect traditional activities and transfer of traditional knowledge and language from tribal elders to tribal youth? And I'd like to show you this figure that APT and DCEP have worked to develop. Through a series of stakeholder workshops, we have engaged the Sanai community, tribal elders, tribal youth, the tribal council, and the natural resource managers in clarifying the San Ildefonso community vision and articulating what it is that is particularly valuable to the Sanai and what they want to preserve about their community vision. And so we've come up with, through this series of workshops, we've come up with the four sections of the circle diagram: community health, infrastructure governance, traditional places, and traditional activities, and that have emerged through this process about talking about what's important. And on the outside of the diagram, you can see these broader themes that have emerged and sort of are relevant to each area. of the community vision. And so as we continue to work with the San Ildefonso, we are trying to develop strategies that help build resilience to impacts on each of these aspects of the community vision. Something that's been very compelling in our work with tribes on climate resilience planning is that climate impacts have such a strong effect on their ability to carry out their traditional activities. And one thing that we've learned from the Sanai in particular is that the changes in habitats and habitat ranges of species that are culturally significant, species that are used in traditional activities or in ceremonies, affects the ability of elders to transfer language to tribal youth. For example, if there used to be a bird species that was important to the tribe because its feathers were used in a ceremony, but that bird is no longer present because it's become too warm in this area of New Mexico, then tribal elders never have the opportunity to share the name of that bird with the youth. Same thing with plants that are shifting ranges. Plants that were used for medicinal purposes or in traditional ceremonies are no longer present on the pueblo, and so the tribal elders never get to share the vocabulary associated with these species and with their use in traditional activities. And it's been a very interesting finding for those of us who work on climate adaptation planning, climate resilience planning in many different contexts and in many different countries. This has been a really revealing and very interesting aspect of the work with the San Ildefonso because of the strong impact of climate change on their traditional activities and their language. And language, Native American languages that are disappearing in many parts of the U.S. and across many tribes is certainly an important impact to consider. And so when we add climate impacts to that dynamic, it can become particularly pressing. I'd like to move on to a follow-up question to Ambassador Lange. Ambassador Lange, what do you think are the two most important actions to take right now to increase the global community's resilience to pandemics?
That's an interesting question because when there is such an urgent need right now for the diagnostic ability to test large numbers of people, determine whether or not they have the novel coronavirus, and for the personal protective equipment that's needed by the healthcare workers. And as you can hear from some of the U.S. governors, the need for intensive care unit beds and ventilators and someday a vaccine. Those are immediate needs, and they're going to save lives, but at the same time, they aren't really going to, in most cases, have much impact on increasing long-term resilience to other pandemics. What I think is important is when possible, as we in the global community are responding to this horrific pandemic, when possible, ensure that capacities are being built in for the long term. Secondly, building on what I said earlier, when there are, as there are in countries all over the world, efforts to provide funding to deal with this immediate concern, recognize that, if at all possible, build in long-term sustainable funding that will be needed for broader pandemics, so that one doesn't have to go back to parliaments and congresses in a few years and saying, well, we need to prepare for another pandemic, and by then people will no longer feel the urgency for the funding, and there will be inadequate funding, as has historically been the case.
And Ambassador Lange, who should lead each of these actions and how?
Yeah, for the funding of both short-term and long-term capacities, first of all, it's the governments themselves have an important role to play, but I think it's worth noting that the World Bank announced just 7 days ago that it has increased its assistance package. It's now has $14 billion of fast-track financing to assist companies and countries in their efforts to prevent, detect, and respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. But that included in that package is funding to strengthen national systems for public health preparedness, including for disease containment, diagnosis, and treatment, as well as support for the private sector. And there's also an effort on the part of some global health experts to try to convince the G20 countries and the G7 countries to establish immediately a global health security challenge fund. Their idea is to have at least $1 billion initially with a mix of public and private international financing to operate as an accelerator for sustainable domestic financing of preparedness. And of course, the United States being an active participant in the G7 and G20 and other governments, it would be up to them to put this together. But the idea is to prioritize what the needs are, where the money would go, but to keep focused on the long-term funding needs through this Global Health Security Challenge Fund. And then finally, I think it's very easy to sit in a webinar like this and to say, well, there should be more money and they should build up preparedness and build up capacities for surveillance and laboratories and trained workers and all of this. But the difficulty comes in getting the funding, but then in implementing. And one of the organizations I'm quite intrigued by, and I'm a participant in, a part of the UN Foundation, is the Alliance for Influenza Preparedness, because it's a group of experts on vaccines who recognize that it's just not practical, if you're concerned about pandemic influenza, to build up factory capabilities in the pharmaceutical industry to create, to mass produce a pandemic influenza vaccine and to have it not used for potentially years or decades even, and then just be ready when the time comes. So what they're trying to do in this Alliance for Influenza Preparedness is to increase the use of seasonal influenza in middle-income countries so that you have the vaccine production capacity, and then whenever there is pandemic influenza, you can quickly use that same facility to produce a vaccine for the pandemic. That's the kind of practical thing that I see as building resilience for future pandemics.
Thank you, Ambassador Lange. Those are very practical, like you said, and concrete actions that we can take now and at a very timely point during this response. Thank you for that. And I have one more question for Sherry. Sherry, discussions about resilience often lead to the question of how to assess and evaluate resilience. Which specific metrics or indicators do you and your colleagues use to assess the resilience of energy systems?
And I think that answers at least a couple of the questions maybe that I've seen in the chat box. So if you can go maybe to the next slide. I want to start by just pointing out a couple of resources. Both are free and online, so great resources for communities that may need some assistance in planning and assessing resilience. So the first is the Resilience Roadmap. So it's a free online toolkit to help facilitate resilience planning at a multi-jurisdictional scale through stakeholder engagement. So it was really designed for US-based communities, but it is broadly applicable, and so it can be adapted to a lot of different scenarios. The second resource is the Resilient Energy Platform. This one's pretty new, and it has a guidebook that specifically walks energy sector decision makers through the process of stakeholder engagement and assessing vulnerabilities and risks, and then developing resilient solutions. So these are really great resources. You can actually see on the Resilient Energy Platform, besides the guidebook, there's stuff like quick reads on just what are other people doing in resilience, a variety of trainings and resources. There's also an Ask an Expert if you just kind of get stuck and don't know where to go. So in terms of some resources online, if you want to look through these, this is a really good starting point. So with that kind of just out of the way, resilience assessment really starts with understanding vulnerability and risk assessment. And Lorine, you mentioned that in your presentation earlier. When we talk about risk, we're really talking about the potential for loss, damage, or destruction resulting from a vulnerability being exposed to a hazard or a threat. And so to understand what that means and to understand and define risk, we really have to look at what hazards or threats are present, how likely they are, how severe they are. And then we start looking at system vulnerabilities to understand the impact of exposing vulnerabilities to those expected hazards. And then really the combination of those gives us an understanding of what the risk would be. So just one way, people often confuse, what's a hazard versus a vulnerability. One way to look at hazards is there are things you can't control. Can't control hurricanes or droughts, earthquakes, cyber attacks, those kind of things. Whereas vulnerabilities are attributes within the system that affects its susceptibility to threats. And so that is something that even though you can't maybe fully mitigate it, you can at least to some extent control it. They can be addressed or at least reduced. So when we start developing indicators for resilience, we look at features that either buffer or amplify the impact of an exposed vulnerability. For example, if we're evaluating resilience of transmission, we look at things like how exposed are the lines? Are they in a floodplain? Are they in a high wind area? Is there regular maintenance routine to minimize contacts with trees? It's really distribution level things, so what connects into houses and buildings. We look at things like, is there redundancy, that the power can flow through different directions. This is one of the reasons that microgrids have become so popular really since about 2012. In cold climate communities, we look at reserves of heating fuels or the ability to switch heating methods just in case supply chains are interrupted. As we understand those risks, we start working on building resilience. And we do this by evaluating the extent to which any proposed solution can actually reduce the overall risk of the system or its components within the system. So many of these solutions are technology-based. For example, I mentioned microgrids, which are smaller grids that can be disconnected from the larger grid in the event of a larger power outage, and they can be run locally to provide power to specific local loads. We look at what we would call distributed energy systems. So if you drive around and see solar on top of your neighbor's house, those would be distributed energy systems. So they're smaller energy systems that just serve a local load. And if we do have those distributed energy systems, how are they connected, or how can they be disconnected from the main grid and islanded in the case of an outage? But we also, we also look at policy and process solutions. So sometimes a simple process change, like making a maintenance plan to reduce the amount of contact between trees and lines, can actually reduce the vulnerability without introducing new technology and generally at lower cost. So once some chosen solutions are implemented, I hate to tell people, but this process is cyclical. You start all over again. So resilience assessment and planning is really iterative. When you address some challenges, you go on and see what additional challenges can be addressed. And one of the things you look at when developing solutions is when we do a full vulnerability assessment of power systems, usually there are tons of different vulnerabilities of varying complexity, and it's almost impossible, if not impossible, to address all vulnerabilities. And so one of the things we also look at is what's that threshold to say, okay, these vulnerabilities are not going to impact the whole system, or they're going to have, sort of minor economic impacts. So we're not going to address those right now, but we're going to address the ones that might take out the whole system or take out large parts of the system that would have severe economic impacts. So that's what we start really looking at, is even where do you draw that line to develop resilience for these different vulnerabilities and risks. Really quick, just because Raymond is not able to make it today, I talked about these metrics, or I'm talking about these metrics in terms of technology and really Western science. I think one thing that I do want to make sure we understand is, when we also talk about resilience and quantifying resilience, there's also things like traditional ecological knowledge that many of our indigenous communities, both in the U.S. and around the world, rely on. And when working with indigenous communities, we want to make sure that we're also including traditional ecological knowledge as a way of characterizing resilience. So I don't at all want to discount those understandings or knowledge sets. Raymond had largely been tasked to talk about those today, but there are ways to characterize, how does this make traditional livelihoods possible? And that's a little bit different than how we typically look at it in terms of just technology and the more sort of Western science side of things.
Sherry, thank you for that. I think that's a wonderful note to end on. I appreciate that sentiment. It looks like we are at the end of our time, but we did see some very good questions in the chat box, and we would be happy to post some answers to those questions along with the recording on the webinar landing page. So we'll be happy to share that when it is posted.